My guests at this time are Mollie Hemingway, senior editor at the Federalist, and Judicial Crisis Network chief counsel Carrie Severino. They're also authors of the #1 bestseller, Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Supreme Court. Over the weekend, Mollie was also responsible for imploding another accusation against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, emerging in a forthcoming book by New York Times reporters. And Carrie and Mollie, thanks very much for being with us.
Great to be here with you.
A year ago, the New York Times refused to publish the allegations of Deborah Ramirez, the Yale classmate of Kavanaugh, who hadn't been sure but was later somewhat sure Kavanaugh had acted in a lewd manner in front of her at a party. Now the Times is publishing excerpts from this new book suggesting there's another incident that sounds somewhat familiar to the Ramirez allegation. Mollie, you ultimately forced the Times to add a pretty important disclaimer that was somehow left out of the story, that the supposed victim here has no recollection of any of this. So explain what went through your mind as you first read this story and how you uncovered the information that the Times initially refused to print.
Well, Carrie and I were not surprised to see this type of thing happen because we wrote about it in the book. We wrote about how there is an ongoing game plan to rewrite history, basically, when it comes to judicial nominations. We've seen it happen with Clarence Thomas. You're seeing it happen with other judges. Now it's happening with Kavanaugh. And it will happen again, the next time they run this playbook, particularly if no one is held accountable. But yes, the allegation that was so weak that even the New York Times was forced to admit it last year is suddenly now, after a year, determined to be not so weak, although they are unclear about why, given that they find no new evidence in support of it. Then they mentioned this other very murky allegation, but they forgot to note that according to their own reporting, the alleged victim denies any knowledge of the supposed incident. So that would seem to be a very important thing to put in a newspaper if you were actually trying to report the news, as opposed to run a campaign of character destruction. But they were forced to put a correction up on the piece last night, and although that is not in any way sufficient to what they did, once again, to Justice Kavanaugh in an attempt to destroy this man.
Carrie, at least 4 Democrats running for president immediately called for the impeachment of Kavanaugh, specifically Harris, Warren, O'Rourke, and Castro, at least. As far as I can see, none have retracted their demands in light of the new information that Mollie squeezed out of the Times here. This was not a political winner for them last year, so why do you think they're eager to go down this road again?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think they would be willing to indict a ham sandwich if it was associated in any way with Trump. I really is a head scratcher. Because I just think they end up with real egg on their face, given the weakness of this claim. I don't know if anyone actually looked at it first, but it just shows how far to the left they are willing to run in an attempt to gain their party's nomination at this point. And unfortunately, that includes making bizarre – I mean, the idea that you could even be impeachable for something that allegedly happened years ago is arguably not even in the constitutional definition of what they could be impeached for. So it's all political grandstanding. It's absolutely never going to happen. Really, I think the end goal of a lot of this is intimidation, not really impeachment. They want Kavanaugh to be scared of what they can and are obviously have proved themselves willing to do to him, and they're hoping maybe he'll moderate his votes in their direction. I don't think that'll work. I think it's a shameful way to behave, and I think this is the kind of thing that makes people really frustrated with our political process.
Let's go back to last year a little bit, Mollie. And I remember on the day that Trump was announcing the selection of Kavanaugh, there was not much advance notice that it was going to be Kavanaugh. So there were literally people outside with defeat fill in the blank because they weren't sure which of the folks on the final list were likely to be the nominee. And pretty much from that point on, there were maybe only a handful of Senate Democrats who made any sort of public comment that they'd be willing to possibly consider Brett Kavanaugh. And by the time the first round of the confirmation hearings were over, that number was probably even smaller. Based on the work you did for this book, how many Senate Democrats cared whether the allegations were true, and how many saw it just as a way to defeat this nomination?
We actually tell stories in there about how frustrated Senate Republicans were by the reflexive opposition that Senate Democrats had to Kavanaugh. So when they're trying to delay the confirmation process, they're throwing all these absurd demands out or new allegations that are completely unsupported. And at one point, Bernie Sanders makes some demand on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Chairman Grassley says, am I to understand that your vote is actually up for grabs now? Because you came out months ago and said you were opposed to this person. Why would we do whatever it is that you want when you don't even consider this person like even a possibility of voting for? And that's what I keep thinking of with this latest allegation, too. They're saying, oh, this shows that there was not enough of an investigation. These people all came out within minutes of Kavanaugh being named, in some cases before he was even named, to say that they were not going to vote for the person. This is not a good faith decision about whether someone really could legitimately have done something. Nobody believes Kavanaugh did any of these things. There's never been any evidence to support the idea that Christine Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh ever met, much less that the assault, as she described it, happened. And there's a ton of reputation. That they are still willing to do this to this man is precisely, again, why we wrote the book. We knew this would happen. We'd seen it before. Carrie clerked for Clarence Thomas, so she's seen how this playbook is played. And we wanted to get the actual facts down, including some of the game playing that was going on during the confirmation process. And we flat out predicted that just this type of thing would happen, and now it has.
Carrie, the Washington Post is out with a new column from left-leaning, to put it charitably, columnist E.J. Dionne, who says in his column that the Supreme Court is broken. He quotes Brett Kavanaugh saying the Supreme Court must never, never be viewed as a partisan institution. And then Dionne says, but that's exactly what it is, thanks to a GOP determined to control it by any means available. It's why questions about Kavanaugh and the court haunt us. So after all the work you've done researching and reporting on this story, how do you react to that sort of analysis?
Look, if there are problems with the way people are viewing the court as political, I think there's a couple sources. One is judges who act politically, and there are definitely examples of that. And whether it's judges switching their votes because they don't want the political outcomes, or judges who determine their votes by the political outcomes, but also this is part of their whole campaign. They're trying to delegitimize the court. They want to, and Deborah Katz, the attorney for Christine Blasey Ford, said she wants an asterisk next to Kavanaugh's name, that motivated Christine Blasey Ford. They're trying to delegitimize their decisions. This is just another step in that. So, no, it's not actually a popularity contest. If the court is viewed as being political because it's political, that's where the problem is for the court. If the court is viewed as being political because a bunch of PR people have decided that that's the attacks they're going to levy against it, that doesn't worry me. That says more about the Democrats' shameful attacks on the court and attempting to being just basically frustrated that it's not doing what they want, more than it says about the court itself.
I'm saying three possible motives here, and there could be a combination of them. One is the one that you ladies mentioned a moment ago, and that's to undermine Brett Kavanaugh and perhaps intimidated him in some way. There's also obviously bracing for the next Supreme Court fight, whether that's in the coming year or sometime soon after that. Or if the Democrats are able to actually win the White House, the Supreme Court, with functional majority perhaps for the right, that's a little more tenuous than that, I would say, but that's like the last hurdle before them really being able to do what they want. So what ultimately is the Democratic endgame here?
Well, I see no reason to think it's not all of these things that are part of the attempt that we're seeing by people on the left. They do place a lot of value in the Supreme Court as the means by which things can be pushed through over and against the will of the people. And as there have been political decisions in recent decades with the court, that's actually what has caused a lot of consternation about the court, when they invent new rights or they don't do good constitutional jurisprudence. And so it's a very important means of power for the left, and they view it as something that they want to have control over. Ideally, it wouldn't matter who nominates a judge, left or right, a justice to the court, that they would just see their job as determining whether a given law is constitutional or not, but that's not the way it is. So it's all of these things. They want to delegitimize the court. They want to threaten people from being even allowing themselves to be nominated. Think about what someone has to think about right now if they were willing to serve in the federal judiciary. Are they willing to put themselves and their family through what the media and the left will put them through for that willingness to serve? It's what is a stifling attempt and a political attempt, and all of these things wrapped up in one.
Last question, and while the New York Times was omitting news from their original version of the story, your book actually breaks some important news, and this is just one piece of it, and that's that, back to Christine Blasey Ford, she cited a woman named Leland Kaiser as a witness for her allegation against Kavanaugh, and according to your book, she received an insane amount of pressure to back up Ford's account, but ultimately she told the truth. What little tease can you give us about what your book uncovered about the pressure on Leland Kaiser?
Yeah, that was one of the stories we loved reporting, and it didn't get enough play because Leland Kaiser is a lifelong Democrat. She's very liberal. She did not want to see Kavanaugh on the court, and she is a friend of Ford's. So she wanted to support her friend, but she could not, after racking her brain, come up with anything that sounded like this story. And what's even more interesting that this new book actually corroborates what we found as well when we first reported, that Leland Kaiser ultimately came to say, you know what, not only do I not remember this story rings false to me. This is not the kind of events we went to. I would never have left a party with not knowing how my friend got home. And that she also had experienced a great deal of pressure from common friends of theirs to change her story, to massage it, to try to be more supportive of Blasey Ford than she felt the facts supported. So I think that was a really damning piece of evidence for those allegations that got overlooked last year in the process, even though a lot of people were aware of it. They didn't look at it closely enough because that didn't fit the narrative that much of the left wanted people to hear. And so we think it's so important to have it out there. And I'm kind of gratified that we now even have corroborating evidence that this is all part of that process.
Well, we'll see how their book sells. The #1 bestseller is entitled Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Supreme Court. Actually, the only one's not confirming that it's #1 is the New York Times, which, given our conversation today, tells you about all you need to know. Ladies, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mollie Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. Carrie Severino, chief counsel at the Judicial Crisis Network. Again, the book Justice on Trial. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.